Ta première langue est français?
L'anglais.
L'anglais?
Oui.
Mauritius. It's like show business. There's no. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. My birth name is Howard Resnick. Born in Los Angeles, and my spiritual name is unpronounceable. Hridayananda Das Goswami or Acharya Deva, and
What do we call you?
what do you call me? Sam? Acharya Deva, you can say. Acharya Deva. And undergraduate, UCLA in Berkeley, and then I much later did my graduate studies doctorate at Harvard in Indian studies, Sanskrit and Indian studies. In the Krishna consciousness movement, back in 1971, I became a president of a temple in Gainesville, Florida, by the University of Florida, and then took on more. I was actually in America, and we opened up dozens of spiritual centers all over Latin America, published millions of books. This sounds like I'm bragging. Anyway, then...
You've been very busy, let's just say.
Yes, been very busy. And then when my spiritual master Prabhupada, who was the founder of the Hari Krishna movement, when he passed on in 1977, he asked me to be one of the sort of successor gurus after him. So I took on more responsibility. And then actually it was after that I went back to school and did my doctorate and everything at Harvard. But because I wanted to see how the world sees us, and how do scholars see us. I remember when I applied to Harvard, you have to write a little biography like why I want to go to the school, and I said that I felt that because I'd lived in such a tight-knit, closed spiritual community that there's a danger of becoming intellectually incestuous. And I needed to remember what the world is and how the world sees us, and maybe they know something we don't know about ourselves. And so...
Did you find that diversity at college?
I did. Actually, it was a very positive experience. And I felt that by doing the whole academic thing, like how does mundane agnostic scholarship see the Hari Krishna tradition? And I didn't just drink that Kool-Aid, but yeah, it did help me to be much more objective. And being in that environment also, I began to look back at the Hari Krishna movement and say, like, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? I didn't doubt our basic teachings that come down from thousands of years ago. I mean, I thought, yeah, that's still on the money. But specifically, I began to think, like, why is it that we always use Indian clothes, even what is now archaic Indian clothes? The Indians don't dress that way anymore. And Indian food, Indian dress, are these things really essential parts of a historical tradition? I began to study the history. And what I basically found out is, nope, that actually... things that, let's say, a typical Hari Krishna might consider to be sort of our eternal spiritual culture, really, centuries ago, was just an adaptation to the then existing South Asian culture. So certain forms of dress, of cuisine, of architecture, of music, and so on, which were adaptations. They were devotees of Krishna hundreds and thousands of years ago trying to fit into their societies, but then it comes down as a sacred tradition when it was really an adaptation, kind of like the Hindu version of Life of Brian by Monty Python. So, and then I knew, because my undergraduate major was History of World Religions at UCLA, I finally got my degree, and I realized that as I started to live outside ashrams and just sort of live in the world, continuing my practice, but living out in the world, that it's, history shows, my own experience shows, that you cannot really transform a society if you're not in the society. You can't stand so far outside of a society and transform it. That's just what history tells us. And the way I put it is, if a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Hindu, or a Hare Krishna all fall off a cliff, they all fall exactly at the same speed according to the laws of physics. And so just as there are certain physical laws, there are certain sociological principles, psychological principles, we don't, I mean, in one sense, we have what we call a transcendental lifestyle or spiritual mission, but on the other hand, in many ways, we do not stand outside the laws of nature, which are laws of God, after all. And therefore, it's like, if we don't eat healthy food, we get sick just like, the unsaved. And so that was being a little facetious, but so my point was that what history shows is that any new religious movement or new spiritual movement that actually succeeded, that became an important religion, had to make this curve, had to adapt, had to fit into the society they're in. It doesn't mean compromising your basic principles, moral, spiritual principles, doesn't mean you have to change your philosophy, but you do have to fit in. So I started this project called Krishna West. The idea being that you could be a serious practitioner of bhakti yoga, and you can love God and God will love you and all that, and you can actually wear normal clothes, and you don't have to use Indian recipes, and you don't have to use Indian architecture. Nothing wrong with those things. India has a great culture. It's just not my culture. It's not the culture I grew up in. And so it spread all over the world, and of course, for some very conservative members, inevitably, I became the anti-Krishna. This stuff is just kind of like sociology 1A. I mean, it's extremely predictable, inevitable human behavior.
Mm-hmm. All told through story, through archetypes and stories.
Yeah.
History.
Yeah. So whenever you have a human community, it can be a political community, a social community, religious, artistic, anything, academic. Whenever you have a community and everybody walks and talks the same way, and then someone does something differently, that some people will think, hey, that's interesting, and a lot of people think, you're a creep, and you're a traitor, and blah, blah, blah. But fortunately, my own teacher, Prabhupada, blessed me. He said that I actually could and should be rational. The first, which was, oh my God.
It is.
When I first joined the Hari Krishna movement in 1969, which is, my God, 49 years ago, so I guess I was like 6 months old at the time, and I crawled into the Hari, I'm just kidding. I'm really a little older than that. It's just, I crawled into the tub. But they say never ask a woman or a swami their age. So when I first joined the Hari Krishna temple, and I was a student at Berkeley, actually with a scholarship at UC Berkeley. And so I didn't know if I should stay in school. I wrote a letter to Prabhupada, and he wrote me back and said, stay in school. Everyone thought he would just say, drop out, tune in and drop out. But he said, stay in school. And then he said, you should get a very good education so that you can explain Krishna consciousness to other educated people. It wasn't that, just read my books, you don't need to know anything else. He actually said, if you want to communicate with educated people, you have to be educated. And so I'm doing that right now. That was, of course, more than... Technically, you only paid for the 3-minute version, but I went and gave you the... I won't charge you for that. Yeah. And so
you're educating. You're educating. Is that where we kind of...
it would be kind of sounds a little proud for me to say that, but yeah, I'm trying to, because Prabhupada always emphasized, interestingly enough, religion and philosophy. Mm-hmm. That you need them together. And obviously religion without philosophy becomes fanaticism and sentimentalism. It's very dangerous. And by philosophy we mean like reason, being rational, being open-minded, and
science-based too, if you will.
Yeah, science. And then and real science, not scientism, which is a whole other field. And then he also said, and science, or not science, philosophy or reason without religion just becomes empty speculation. And if you look at the intellectual history of the West, there's no greater proof of the total vacuous dead end, which is godless intellectualism. Yeah. So, and by philosophy, it's interesting because there's a very common idea in the Hari Krishna movement that, yes, we want religion and philosophy, but that means we need religion and the philosophy. Because it's just like in the early days of the Renaissance, actually first it started with the Muslim Renaissance, back in the days when the Western Europeans were the terrorists and the Muslims were the cosmopolitan, learned people. But anyway, if you said the philosopher, it meant Aristotle. Because Aristotle had been recovered. The Muslims actually preserved Greek philosophy during the Dark Ages. And so the philosopher was Aristotle. Then, of course, Plato came roaring back. But so, similarly, in the Hari Krishna movement, if you say the philosophy, right, it means our philosophy, which I stand by. I think it is a super philosophy, but so in ISKCON, or the Hari Krishna movement, there's a tendency to think religion and philosophy means that you know the philosophy. In other words, you kind of memorize the doctrine, or you know our philosophy, and you're religious, and you worship Krishna. But interestingly, if you look at what Prabhupada meant, he meant something more like what modern people would mean when they say philosophy. He meant the ability to reason well, the ability to fairly evaluate arguments, to put forward cogent arguments. In other words, to be rational, to have that ability. And so it's kind of revolutionary in a religious society to say that we should reason, because there's always a danger that you'll reason yourself to the devil.
Well, yeah. Can I say something?
Please.
I think it's interesting because what I'm seeing in my, I'm almost 40, but it's also happening in the generation behind me, is this intolerance starting to happen of things that are not rational. Why? Why do I do this? And the awakening is emerging in all these little pockets, because it doesn't matter if you're spiritual or not, but what matters is if you want to know your soul, if you want to know who you are, and light and love and connection, and like these really great things that make you feel really good. And so we're looking at that, and then we're looking at, but this is what I'm doing, and it doesn't seem rational at all. And so what you're saying completely supports what I'm seeing just in the culture that I can perceive.
Thank God. Well, that's encouraging. Maybe I can actually communicate with someone. That's great. So, fortunately, I think for me, when I look at the Hari Krishna movement, the teachings, the practices, and all that with a very rational lens, it stands up. At least the teachings. The teachings. Now, obviously, you can take a rational body of teachings and you can sentimentalize them, or you can weaponize them as sort of like this dogmatic only way thing. And so, if you want to think that you're better than other people and you want to put down other people, then you can weaponize even rational teachings, just like you can weaponize science. And so, but the basic philosophy of Krishna consciousness does hold up as a coherent and I think really, super advanced theology, you could call it, or philosophy. But then when you look at the practice, and even the basic practice, to me, totally holds up. What's interesting is that there are fundamental principles and then just sort of external details. Because, for example, if you look at history, when human beings are inspired by what they believe, it could be as a religious revelation, or they could be inspired by a political situation like nationalism. There's a national anthem, which I won't tell you if I stand up or sit down, but it's like whenever people are inspired by a nation state, by a religion, they sing about it. America, America, or Hari Krishna. And so, but there's no such thing as music in general. There are only specific kinds of music, like, there's jazz, there's pop, there's rock, there's Baroque, there's romantic, there's early classical, there's all kinds of, calypso, reggae. So there's no music in general. There are specific kinds of music. And so inevitably, when people anywhere in the world, anytime in history, whether their inspiration is political, religious, or whatever it may be, they make music about it. And they make specific music based on the culture they're living in. And the same happens when they want to write poems or other literature, when they want to erect buildings to honor, whether it's like the Congress building or a church or mosque or mandir or synagogue. And yet there are only specific kinds of architecture. And so people draw upon their cultural resources to create culture to express their devotion. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that although the specific cultural forms of architecture, cuisine, music, poetry, literature, although those forms came from just some historical ethnicity, it takes on this sacred aura. So that, let's say, not only is the name of God holy, but a particular kind of music, which can be, let's say, classical Indian music, Hari Krishna Kirtan, or it can be the music of some other part of the world, for whether it's Orthodox Jews or certain different Catholics or Christians, and so that external ethnic thing becomes also somehow eternal and holy. So, like for example, in the spiritual world, people speak Arabic, or they speak Hebrew, or they speak Sanskrit. So it's And the problem, though, is that when you sacralize what ultimately is just a mundane ethnic thing, and you sacralize it, then people outside that ethnicity, can't really relate to it.
Right. And, I mean, there's beautiful parts about that when we travel and we go to other parts of the country, and there are ceremonies or sacred events. Where it is beautiful for us to be able to witness.
Right.
And it seems, from my point of view, that the education part of it that would be so helpful
yes.
is missing somehow.
Well, it also depends on what the purpose is. Like, for example, if in America the Hari Krishna wants to just preserve and make available sort of historic Indian religious culture, to preserve it, and so, wow, nice little addition to diversity, just like we don't want any single little bird or lizard, or not speak of mammals, to go extinct because they all add something to the environment. And so that idea of preserving all languages and preserving all cultures. So if we want to be kind of like a little ethnic living museum, that's nice. But if we want to spiritually transform the world, then we can't just be a little museum act. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We actually have to communicate. So it depends on what you want to be. Do you want to be a little ethnic museum, or do you want to actually become a powerful spiritual force within the society?
Yeah, and maybe there is something to having the ethnic museum be in its place as a museum, as something to draw from for visual aid, or like.
I'm not. Yeah.
No.
Well, like for example, what if, let's say, a Christian group appeared in the streets of your city, dressed like Palestinians or Israelis 2,000 years ago, and they said that in order to really serve Jesus, this is how you have to dress, because this is how Jesus dressed. If I saw that,
oh yeah, no.
I think these people are very sincere and very eccentric. Isn't it? I mean, what would you think?
They just appeared in your city.
Well, and Hari Krishna. So I think that, telling people, frankly, I think anyone that has any common sense in the society in general knows that God doesn't love you more, and you don't love God more if you dress a certain way. I mean, it's just common sense. But I think, for example, dressing chastely, that's not ethnic, that's principled. In other words, the way I put it is that if the purpose of life is enlightenment, if the purpose of life is self-realization, to awaken your love of God and all other souls, then obviously when you go out on the street, the last thing in the world you want to do is make people forget God and remind them of your dying body. Because, if someone becomes attached to your body, or, well, my body, that's not really going to happen, but let's say, for example...
Come on now.
So, I'm really, to me, it's like an act of cruelty. And so now there's this whole thing about, it's good to be sexy and all that. Welcome to full-scale barbarism. It's, why do you, you can be beautiful, you can be well-groomed, you can be dressed nicely, but the idea that you want to present yourself in public in a way that you sexually arouse other people, not so much that they rape you, but just so that, it's like it feeds my vanity if I see that other people think I'm sexy or kind of, aroused by me. And so, in other words, you have this monstrous situation where just to feed their own stupid vanity, people are enthusiastic to make other souls forget God. And if you say a word against that, then you're body shaming them, and blah blah blah, and no, it's good to be said. I read this column by a lady, and she was saying, I forget what she was talking about. It was something about the Me Too thing. I forget what side she was coming in on, but it was it's a whole mealy now. But she was saying that, yes, I told my daughter, it's good to be sexual. And I was thinking, I'm not going to the other extreme, like be ashamed of your body, but you're a soul. You're an eternal soul. And so is it good to really be focused on the dress that's covering the soul? No. It's good to be focused on the soul. And here's some probably moderate, I wouldn't say conservative, but a moderate, educated journalist encouraging her daughter to not think about her soul, but just really get into the body, and it's good to just identify with your body rather than and forget your own soul. That's good.
Well, what we're seeing with Facebook is it's caused a huge problem. Huge problem. And it's exactly what you're talking about, where people are wrapping their lives and their identities up in something that is not real or true. And then feeding off of that their demons, their ego, their things that are going to control them within their reality that they've created for themselves. And I know I've been reading a lot of interviews and listening to interviews of people that have developed Facebook they have remorse at this point that has become something that is damaging our society now. And they don't know how to turn it around. And so I feel like there are people like us that are waking up on the ground level that can do the work that needs to be done, eye to eye, person to person, take us out of the world that is damaging, bringing us back to connection, true connection.
Yes.
That is long lasting.
Yeah, whole connection.
Whole.
I was fortunate that in my parents' generation, Tom Brokaw, he used to be a big news anchor. He wrote that book called The Greatest Generation or something. It was a big best-selling book. He was talking about my parents' generation, the one that went through the Depression as children, went through World War II, the Nazis, and the Pearl Harbor and all that, and somehow they worked hard and built up the country. And he called it the best generation or the greatest generation. It was a big best-selling book, but I was fortunate, I think, to grow up. Hollywood always ridicules and demonizes the 50s. And I can never, whenever I see those movies, that's not what it was like when I was growing up. But my parents were married, and they remained married until my father passed away. They were married, I guess, almost 6 years, and all my aunts and uncles. People actually had the power to make commitments. They had the power to keep their vows. It's a big deal.
Authenticity.
Yeah, and they loved each other. They weren't just like suffering through it for the sake of the kids. They really. And so, Yeah, there's kind of like this, what I call generational narcissism, where like each generation will think like, everything before us was not as advanced, or they didn't understand this, they didn't understand that, and so, yeah, so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to somehow find a way to teach spiritual knowledge. One of the things I'm doing now, apart from Krishna West, is I'm finishing up a novel, because strangely enough, most people don't buy books that are Sanskrit translations. That's a tough one to figure out. But so I thought that, because I've done a lot of translations, so I'm finishing a novel and trying to reach people, just trying to reach millions of people in a cultural language that they can relate to.
Yeah, it's needed right now. There's a thirst and there's movement, and there's a lot of people that are, in a sense, lost because they're waking up without clear direction. And what's coming through for me is that clear, directive voices, people that are walking the walk, showing through their actions. They're the way seers in the dark, so to speak. I mean, I feel like I'm one because I hold a little torch for my own self, like blind leading the blind. Here we go, I don't know, hopefully this all works out, But I think it's super powerful when we have people like yourself that can speak many languages, which ultimately becomes one language. If you are able to understand those languages, then you understand universal language, and then you're speaking the language of the people, no matter where you are. Because there's symbols no matter where you are. People resonate with symbols.
Yeah, and people are people.
People are people.
Yeah, you study history or go to foreign countries, when you get past the surface, you realize they're just us.
Yeah.
What would you think would be the best way to reach out to, like, people of my generation?
Whoa, your generation. How old are you now?
25, almost.
I'm sure everyone tells you look younger. So, every generation is different, of course. We know they have different names, Gen X and this and that, millennials. I know I kind of lose track of this stuff, but I guess I believe, for one reason, because it's just too much for me to keep up with the idiosyncrasies of every generation, but somehow or other I'm putting my faith in terms of my outreach in what you said, just trying to speak the truth openly, straightforwardly, but in a reasonable, sincere way and in a relevant way. Reasonable, relevant, and with the hope that people of any generation will recognize it as a sincere, reasonable statement. You, because you're right there, I mean, you understand much better than I do what people in your expect you to sound like them, because you're like... So in that sense, I guess you have an advantage and a disadvantage. And my advantage is that they'll kind of be they'll give me a break because they can see that, how in the world could he know? And so so if I can say something that's reasonable, they'll listen to it. Your advantage is that you actually know them. I mean, you speak their language, you know their issues, you know how they feel. And so you can reach them directly. But that's, to take a movement in sociological terms, to take a movement and to preserve it as a movement so it doesn't just become sort of a sedentary religion. Yeah. Like, for example, take the Salvation Army. You know the Salvation Army? What that is? Oh, their group, they ring bells and they especially in Christmas time, they get charity.
They get donations and charities, and they have thrift stores and sell stuff, and it's all for charity.
Yeah, but in America, everyone knows the Salvation Army. What's interesting is, if you think of that name, Salvation Army, originally they were a very militant, hardcore group. There's a great play by George Bernard Shaw called Major Barbara. And they made a movie of it, and it's a great movie and great actors, and it really examines the idea, what does it really mean to serve God? You can find it on YouTube, Major Barbara. Okay. It's really worth seeing, and they have the best actors. It's made, I think, in the 30s or 40s, but it's a super movie. And very relevant to us. So in the movie The Salvation Army, they're militant. They all had ranks, like military ranks, and they were like militant and hardcore and uncompromising. And yet over time it became what we know as the Salvation Army, just these nice people that collect used clothes and furniture and give it out to poor people. And it's about as radical as a teapot. So what happened is, so if you look at all these different, like Methodists were revolutionary. I mean, you look at all these movements they were truly movements. They weren't just churches. I mean, Methodism wasn't a church. It was a movement, a dynamic movement, and so many other groups. And yet, over time, if you're not successful, you just disappear. And if you are successful, then you become a church. So for ISKCON, especially because of the huge Indian diaspora in the Western world, I think the real challenge is, can we remain a movement? It's like when you're young and poor, you'd be hungry to make money and get ahead, but then once you have all that, you're not really hungry anymore. You really, you may not want to fight, you may just want to lay back and get your villa somewhere and just enjoy the fruits of your hard work.
So what do you think it would take for, I'm sorry if I'm...
No, go ahead.
Okay, one last question.
No, because that's what Gandharvika was saying, like, and so I was sort of taking I was just taking a step back from that and saying, ISKCON as a society, as an international society, how eager is it really, apart from just sort of like, saying the right things, but to what extent is the Hari Krishna movement in America, in Canada, in Germany, in Brazil, Mexico, to what extent is the Hari Krishna movement a movement that really is mobilized and enthusiastic and really moving, and to what extent is it sort of a comfortable, self-accommodated church that pays lip service to mission, to the need for a mission, because we have to occasionally say things like that, but that in their real life, everyone is just kind of pursuing their life. And it's a real question, not a rhetorical question. And so it's something, so in answer to Gandharvika, I guess I'm saying, like, yeah, we really have to keep alive that flame of really trying to transform the world. And then I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were asking something.
It just seems like we've built up so many constructs that aren't real.
Oh, labels! That reminds me. It's one of the first things I'm sorry, I interrupted you again.
Labels, you want to say it? Go ahead.
Yeah, labels. By the way, I have these nice, cute little labels in different colors I'm going to stick on all of you before you leave.
That's a blessing.
Beware of radical slogans. I'll start with that. I know, for example, slogans can often be irrational. I'll give you an example. When I was in Berkeley in the late 60s, and I was out on the street and all these famous demonstrations and political events and everything, and there were two branches, you could say, of the leftist movement, which were completely contradictory, but no one noticed. One was the free love movement, because coming out of the much more conservative culture of our parents, and the idea, if it feels good, do it, and people have a right to have sex, and you don't have to be married to have sex. Basically, that was it. It's basically the movement in favor of premarital sex. And the great slogan of that movement was, "You can't legislate morality." You've heard that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
What was interesting is the very same people who were defending premarital sex by saying you can't legislate morality, the very same people were marching to Washington to demand that Congress legislate morality through a civil rights bill. Because after all, what is a civil rights bill if not an attempt to legislate morality? And I even saw that. I remember I saw this little thing on the news several years ago, which I thought was an amazing example of clueless intellectuality, where in Minnesota passed an anti-pornography law. This was maybe like 10 years ago. Minnesota passed an anti-pornography law, but apparently the language of the law was so broad that the store at one of their main museums got caught up in the law because they had art books with, with naked people. And so it's kind of like, are we really going to prosecute the museum shop? And so anyway, so it became a sort of a controversy, and they were interviewing this guy who was the director of a museum. I mean, that's, educated guy who's the director of a major museum, and he said you can't legislate morality. Now what I was thinking, okay, then let's roll back all the laws against rape, murder, breaking and entering, because killing someone is immoral. Raping someone is immoral. It's not merely illegal, it's immoral. And so a law against rape or murder is in fact an attempt to legislate morality.
Yeah.
And so if you actually don't want to legislate morality, then why do we have laws against murder and rape?
Right.
And yet here this guy was on television, the so-called, intellectual, director of a museum, saying that you can't what they actually mean when they say you can't legislate morality is you can't legislate morality against anything I'm in favor of. But if I favor the law, then you absolutely must legislate morality.
Yeah, of course.
So and the same thing with labels. First of all, let's say being a labeler is a label. So if you can't put labels on things, that means we shouldn't distinguish between, let's say, reptiles and mammals. That is a sort of somehow an undesirable distinction. Or between men and women. Or between parents and children. That's a label. Parents, children, teachers, students, people certified to fly commercial jets, and people you definitely don't want to be on the plane if they're flying. Is that a label that this person is a certified commercial airline pilot? Mm-hmm. That's a label, or maybe what about someone that's actually a doctor? Maybe just, interestingly, before the sort of the 1870s or whatever it was, 1880s, there were no legal requirements in America to call yourself a doctor. So if you thought you could cure people, or if you just thought you could make money claiming to be able to cure people, then you could just hang your shingle. You could just say, it's just like nowadays. Yeah, if you just say okay, I'm a healer, or I'm a life coach or something, it was like that. It was unregulated. Interestingly, the AMA made a push to legally restrict who could call themselves a doctor over the issue of abortion, where the AMA was against abortion. That's just history, but what I'm saying is that, so was that a step backwards to require people to be certified as medical practitioners, or should we just allow anyone that feels like it to operate, just cut people open and do things, and maybe someone knows nothing about it, but they just feel lucky that day. So what about labels like that? Doctor, judge, lawyer, airline pilot, mother, father. So when you say don't label, I think you need to explain more. Like, what do you really mean? What do they really mean?
Pigeonhole. Like, put this there. This is that.
Well, you see, that can be a drive toward existential freedom, or it can simply be narcissism.
Yeah.
Because what if someone calls you something and they're right?
Right.
It's almost like saying that when you say don't label, sure, I mean, obviously you can excessively label, you can inaccurately label, you can harmfully label. Those are all possible. But at the same time, it seems like narcissism, I mean, in a sense, they say in Brazil, they have a saying that every society gets the leader it deserves, the government it deserves. And so in a country of narcissists, we got the narcissist in chief. But when you say like don't label, it almost sounds to me like no one has a right or the ability to say anything about me because my own self-definition is the only one that's really valid. And I will probably give myself a very flattering self-definition. To me, it sounds like narcissism. It's like no one has a right to talk about me, even if they're right, even if they're objective. No one has a right to say anything about me. And it's, again, it could have a good application. It could be beneficial and reasonable in some ways. In other words, if you would say, don't mislabel me. Mm-hmm. But in this life, I definitely have certain identities. Like, for example, I have a male body. And I have a Caucasian body, which means basically that I'm a fascist pig because I have a white male body. But
They're also descriptors.
yes, descriptors, right?
for the eyes. That's what a child would say.
So yeah, so I'm. If someone says don't label, I would say I need more information. That's TLI, too little information.
Okay. Die. It's 4:10. How are we doing on your time?
Oh, well, do you want to do a commercial or? Is Mauritius?
This was wonderful content. We can spread the word with this.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I'm good with what I have. If there's anything else that you want to add or questions.
No, Gandharvika?
Thank you.
Cool.
Setu?
Oh no.
Setu?
Say two.
That's all?
That's all.
I wanna.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I wanna thank you for being part of this.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Blessing this guy, gift from Krishna, to be able to serve you in any way, and I've been praying a lot. For
Oh, thank you.
And I hope somehow this project benefit your.
Oh, I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will.
Yes.
No, it was a pleasure to meet Molly and Gandharvika. Definitely two good guys.
All right.